Now today we want to look at supply. We also want to do the same analysis as demand. Now supply is defined as the quantity of a commodity that sellers are willing and able to supply or to sell at a given price over a given period of time. The quantity of the commodity that sellers are willing to sell at a particular price over a given period of time is what is defined as supply. We need to distinguish supply from stock. So there is a difference between supply and stock. Stock is the quantity, the total quantity of a commodity which is available at any specific time. Where is that part of stock which is often or which is offered for sale at any price. So the total commodity which is available at any specific time is what we refer to as stock. While supply is that part of stock which is offered for sale at any price. So we are given some illustrations of oil, but for example, the oil that is not estimated of the world's oil fields, but only the amount that is put on sale at a particular price will bring into the market. So supply will always change with the price change. So when the price changes, the quantity that is supplied also changes. From there, we can now state the law of supply. What does the law of supply says? So the law of supply states that other things remains constant. An increase in the price will lead to an increase in the quantity supplied. And when the price falls, the quantity supplied also falls. That is what the law of supply states. To continue, I said the law of supply states that other things held constant, an increase in the price will lead to an increase in the quantity supplied, and vice versa. So that simply means that the relationship between the price and the quantity supplied is proportional. That means if the price increases, more is put on sale. So the suppliers are simply motivated by high prices. So they will supply more to the market if the price increases. So we have a supply schedule, and the supply schedule is defined as a table showing quantities sellers are willing to put in the market at all possible prices. So the schedule that gives the quantity that sellers are willing to put in the market against the price is what we refer to as the supply schedule. We normally use the supply schedule to draw the supply curve. So from this supply schedule, we can draw the supply curve. So you can see the supply curve is upward sloping. So which means that as the price increases, more is put in the market, more is sold in the market. So the suppliers are motivated by high prices. That is why this curve is upward sloping. So if the price increases, for example, from 1 to 2, the quantity that is supplied to the market increases from 2 to 4. As the price continues to increase, more quantity is actually supplied. So the supply curve is upward sloping from the law of supply that we have just mentioned. So which means that as the price increases, more is supplied to the market. So we can simply say that the supply curve slopes upwards from left to right. So which indicates that sellers are willing to supply more at higher prices. And of course, they will supply at lower prices. So the supply curve is simply upward sloping because of the relationship between supply and demand. So the factors that influence supply. So supply is influenced by quite a number of factors. And one of the factors that we can mention is the price of the commodity. So from the law of supply, I think you can follow how the price affects the quantity supplied or influences quantity supplied. At higher prices, producers are motivated to produce more, thereby increasing the supply of the commodity under consideration. At lower prices, less is supplied because producers will see no reason why they should produce more because the profitability will be negative in that case. So in simple terms, the higher price motivates producers to produce more, hence increasing supply, while lower prices will simply reduce the supply of that commodity because you reduce the profitability of producers, and therefore producers will feel no need to continue supplying at negative profits. And the second factor that influences supply is the objective of the farm. Now, a farm can have various objectives. For example, profit maximization is an objective of the farm. And for the farm to maximize profits, it will require that more be supplied at higher prices. But if the objective of the farm is welfare maximization, then it will not follow that law. The welfare maximization is different from profit maximization. So those farms that seek profit maximization will tend to at higher prices to the market. But those farms that seek welfare maximization, they don't follow that law. They will simply seek to maximize the welfare of the consumers, for example. And you cannot maximize the welfare of the consumer by increasing prices. So for those farms that seek welfare maximization, they will not supply higher prices. Therefore, the objective of the farm will influence the demand, the supply of product. Now, the third factor that we can mention is technology used. So if a farm uses better methods of production, so we expect output to economically increase. So if output increases, then the supply of that commodity will also increase. So better technology normally reduces the cost of production. So if they reduce the cost of production, farms will be motivated to produce more. Therefore, more can be supplied at some price per cost of production. So if the cost of production, or what we refer to as the average cost, reduces, the farms will tend to increase their output. But where the method of production or the technology that is being used does not reduce the cost of production, or it increases the cost of production, so the farms to cut down the level of output in order to cut the cost, and that definitely will influence the quantity supplied. So the fourth factor that also influences supply is the cost of production. So farms normally produce using the factor inputs like land, labor, and other inputs. Now, if the price of one of the inputs or more increases, so the cost of production will increase, and the farms will tend to reduce the cost of production by lowering the quantity supplied or the output. So this will simply reduce the quantity supplied to the market. But if the cost of production is low, then farms will tend to expand their output so that they can supply more to the market. So the cost of production is a key factor that influences the quantity supplied in the market. Now, we also have government policies, and this is under the taxation policies of the government. Now, an increase in a tax for commodity simply means an increase in the cost of supplying that commodity. So the taxes of the government influence the supply of the commodity. So if the government raises indirect taxes on the commodity, the indirect taxes is what we refer to as the VAT or excise duty. So the cost of production will go up, cost of supplying that commodity will go up. And this will imply that farms will cut down their level of output because of increased taxes. So the taxes normally make the commodity more expensive than competing products and will simply cut down their level of output, which eventually reduces supply. So the sixth factor that also has supply is what we refer to as the subsidies. Now, a subsidy is simply a payment that is made by the government to producers to incur part of the production costs. So if the government pays subsidies to some goods or the production of some goods, it's simply making the production of those goods cheaper, the producer. And this will eventually increase output, which increases supply. So where the government increases subsidies, the producers of those goods, supply will increase. But if the government reduces that subsidy, it implies that the cost of production will go up, and this will discourage producers from producing more of those goods, and the supply will eventually go down. So the other factor that we can mention is weather conditions. So particularly for agricultural products, they are influenced by weather changes. So during rainy season, for example, the agricultural produce increases. But if there is unfavorable weather conditions, then the supply of such products normally reduces. The price of competing products can also influence supply. And in this case, producers normally use the factors of production to produce. If there is a product whose prices have increased relative to what is being produced currently, so normally the producers will simply shift to that line of production, or they will shift their factors of production to those goods whose prices have increased in relative terms. Therefore, those goods that the price remains unchanged, the supply will go down as suppliers shift their factors of production to areas or to products that have high prices. Peace and security is also a key factor in the supply of a commodity. Those countries that are experiencing insecurity or political instability, supply is normally affected because there is no productive activities that are taking place in those areas or countries. And this will normally affect supply negatively. So the development of infrastructure, particularly transport and communication, will also affect supply. So this normally comes in when these goods are being moved to wherever they are needed. So if we don't have a good infrastructure, facilities, then movement of such goods is difficult, and this will affect the supply of the commodity. So those are the factors that influence the supply of the commodity, the market. We have looked at the supply curve, and they said the supply curve simply shows the relationship between the price and the quantity supplied. Now we want to look at movement along the supply curve. So what does movement along the supply curve imply? Now, the movement along the supply curve is caused by a change in the price of the commodity. So if the price of the changes, the supply or the supplier simply moves along the same supply curve. So if we have a supply curve, for example, which is like this, so this is the price, and then this is the quantity that is supplied. So we have supply curve that is upward sloping. So if we have different levels of the price, you can see this can be P1. So it increases to P2. We want to see what will happen. So if the price increases to P2, you can see what happens. This is Q1, then this is Q2. So the producer will simply move along the same supply curve from point A to point B. So this is what we refer to as movement along the supply curve. So the producer will simply move along the supply curve, along the same supply curve. So the upward movement is caused by an increase in the price. So if the price increases, the producer will simply move upwards from point A to point B. But if the price falls, then producer will move backwards from point B to point A. So in simple terms, movement along the supply curve is caused by a change in the price only. The other factors that we have mentioned causes a shift in the supply curve. So this is the supply curve you can see. So from point C to D is what we refer to as a movement along the supply curve, and it's caused by a price increase. But from point D to C, a movement again along the same supply curve, but it's caused by a decrease in the supply curve. So these changes can take place in opposite directions. That is what we refer to as movement along the supply curve, which is caused by a change in the price only. So a movement from point C to D is caused by an increase in the price, and the movement from D to C is caused by a fall in price. That is what we call movement along supply curve. So we also have a shift in the supply curve. A shift in the supply curve is caused by a change in all other factors that we have mentioned apart from the price. So when those other factors changes, we have a shift in the supply curve. Now this shift can be towards the right, or it can be towards the left. So if the supply curve shifts towards the right, it means there is an increase in supply. So a shift to the right simply shows an increase in supply, while a shift to the left shows a decline in supply. So if you show the supply curve shifting to the left, that implies a fall in supply. If it shifts to the right, then it means that supply has increased. So as you can see in this diagram, we have the supply curve S in the middle. Then we have S1 towards the right, and then S2 towards the left. So S2 shows that supply has reduced. So this can happen at a specific what? So the price simply remains the same, but the quantity supplied has changed. So you can look at that diagram. So the price remains the same, but the quantity supplied has changed. I've given the reasons for the change in supply as the change in other factors that we have discussed, which influence supply apart from the price. So, for example, we mentioned technology. A favorable change or an improvement in the state of technology will lead to an increase in supply. That will cause a shift in the supply curve towards the right. But if the level of technology deteriorates, that simply means farms will not be able to produce as more as before. And this will be represented by a shift in the supply curve towards the left, so which is S2. So S2 shows a reduced level of supply. So if you look at the supply curve that we have just mentioned, they are upward sloping. So for normal goods, they are upward sloping. But it's not always that the supply curve slopes upward. We have some cases where the supply curve is abnormal, which means it does not slope upwards from left to right. Those supply curves that behave like that, they are referred to as the abnormal supply curves. So which means they don't obey the law of supply. So the law of supply simply says that an increase in the price will lead to an increase in the quantity supplied. But for abnormal supply curves, they don't obey that law. So which means as the price falls, less is supplied, more is supplied. Now, the case in hand for abnormal supply curve is simply the labor supply for target workers. So the labor supply for target workers don't obey that law of supply. So this is because at high wage rates, supply the labor simply supplies lower hours to work. So if the wage rate is high or at high wage rates, the target workers are willing to work for less hours. So while at low wages, the target workers are willing to work for more hours. So if you try to draw the supply curve in that case, simply behaves abnormally. It doesn't slope upwards, but downwards. Or there's a backward bending curve. That violates the law of supply that we've just mentioned. So you can see from this diagram, so this curve is not upward sloping, downward sloping. It has a bend somewhere here. So which means at low wage rates, the worker commits more hours to work. For example, when the wage rate is 2, the worker will need to work for 10 hours. When the wage rate increases to 4, the worker will work for 6 hours. And when the wage rate is 6, the worker will commit 4 hours to work. So you can see as the wage rate increases, the worker reduces the number of hours committed to work. Therefore, this violates the law of supply. That's why it is referred to as abnormal supply curve. So it is assumed that the target worker has themselves a target of 20 every day at a wage rate of 2 shillings per hour. So that is from the diagram that we have just analyzed. So at 2 shillings per hour, this worker will commit 10 hours to work in order to get 20 shillings per day. When the wage rate increases to 4 shillings per hour, he is willing to work for 5 hours in order to sustain his income of 20 a day. So as the wage rate is increased further to 10 shillings per hour, then the worker reduces his working hours further to 2 hours per day. Now this gives a downward sloping supply curve as indicated here. So at 10 shillings per hour, this guy works for only 2 hours. So that gives a downward sloping supply curve. So the higher the wage rate, the lesser the labor supplied, and vice versa. Now there is what we call the substitution effect and the income effect. At high income, at high wage rates, we have an income effect where the worker simply substitutes the work hours for leisure. And at low wage rates, the worker substitutes the leisure hours or the leisure hours for work. He would prefer to work more in order to increase his income. That is why the labor supply curve behaves abnormally. That is upward sloping. Now, we have analyzed the demand and the supply. Now we need to see the interaction of demand and the supply. So the interaction of demand and the supply gives rise to what is referred to as market equilibrium. So we need to look at the market equilibrium and see how we can obtain the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. Now, our objective in studying the market equilibrium is simply to determine the market price and the market quantity, and of course, look at the forces that influence such a price and quantity. Now, equilibrium can be defined as a state of balance or a state of rest. So it's simply a situation whereby the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. Now, this statement is important. The quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded at the equilibrium point. So in this case, we can say that the market is clearing. So if the market is clearing, there is no economic forces that generate a change at this point. And therefore, we have a stable, or the market is stable at that point. Now, geometrically, the equilibrium point is obtained at the point of intersection of the demand and the supply curves. Point where the demand and the supply curve intersect, that is where we have an equilibrium point. If you look at this diagram, for example, the demand and the supply intersect at point E. So we have an equilibrium point at point E. That is where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. So the price that is corresponding to the equilibrium point is what we refer to as the equilibrium price, and the quantity as the equilibrium quantity. Now, if the price that is prevailing in the market is above the equilibrium price, we will have a situation of excess supply in the market. So, for example, assume we have P1. So P1, now the price that is above the equilibrium price. So we will have a situation of excess supply in the market. And this excess supply is represented by this part or distance here. So it will simply give a situation of excess supply. So whenever we have a higher price than the equilibrium price in the market, we will have a situation of excess supply. Now, if the price is below the equilibrium price, we will have a situation of excess demand. Assume now the price is P2. So what will happen in this case? We will have a situation of excess demand. So this distance here simply gives excess demand, in that consumers need more than what the producers or sellers are willing to put for sale in the market. So this gives a situation of excess supply or excess demand. So you can see that the forces of demand and supply determines the price in the market. So the price at which the demand equals supply is referred to as the equilibrium price, while the quantity is referred to as the equilibrium quantity. So I've tried to explain what happens if price is above the equilibrium price. So the forces of demand will work together and lower the price towards the equilibrium whenever there is such an imbalance in the market. So if there is excess supply in the market, the price will simply fall. So it will fall and bring equilibrium back to point E. And whenever we have excess demand in the market, so the price will simply increase. So if the price increases, it will clear the excess demand in the market and equilibrium is restored. So any excess demand will trigger market reaction, and of course, price will have to increase to clear the excess demand in the market. So I think I've explained well that diagram, what happens. Now, that's the graphical analysis. We also have a mathematical analysis. So the mathematical analysis, if we have the demand function and the supply function, we can always get the quantity, that is the equilibrium quantity and price. The only thing that you need to understand is the equilibrium condition. At equilibrium, this condition must always be observed. That is, the quantity demanded should be equal to the quantity supplied. So where we have a demand function, we also have a supply function. Given that at the point of equilibrium, the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied, we can equate the demand function and the supply. So let's equate this with this and solve for P. So 3550 minus 266P is equal to 126. Sorry, 1526 plus 240P. So you can get the like terms together here and solve for P. If you do that, your P will be equal to 4. So, which means the equilibrium price is 4 shillings. So you can substitute this in n of this equation and get the equilibrium quantity. So if you try to substitute P in n of the equations, so you get that your quantity supplied, or the equilibrium quantity, simply 24.8. That is the equilibrium quantity. And we also have the equilibrium price. So that is the mathematical part of the equilibrium analysis. So this is the supply function, the demand function. At the point of intersection here, we have equilibrium price given as 4 shillings, the equilibrium quantity given as 24.86. Now we have different types of equilibrium can mention. So we have a stable equilibrium, we have an unstable equilibrium, and then we have a neutral equilibrium. A stable equilibrium, so for the case of stable equilibrium, so if there is a force that disrupts the market, then there will be an adjustment that brings back the initial equilibrium. So this type of equilibrium is what we have just discussed. Whenever we have a disturbance in the equilibrium, the market will react either through an increase in the price or a reduction in the price, which brings back equilibrium in the market. That is what we have discussed. So for unstable equilibrium, so unstable equilibrium, this occurs when the deviation from the equilibrium position pulls the market further away from the equilibrium conditions of unstable equilibrium. So For example, when the demand curve is positively sloped, as the case of a given good, so when this happens, whenever we have a disturbance, so the equilibrium point simply moves away from the equilibrium point. So you can see this case. We have an equilibrium point at that point. So you have the demand, the supply curve. We also have the demand curve and the supply curve. Both are upward sloping. So that's why if there is an increase in the price, for example, the demand simply moves away from the equilibrium point. So you can see, simply moves away. That is what we refer to unstable equilibrium. It occurs for given goods, for example, which don't obey the law of demand. So the equilibrium point is PEQE. So if the price increases from PE to Q1, excess demand over supply is shown by this diagram that I've just indicated here. So you can see there is a situation of excess demand. Now, because of the excess demand, the price will continue to go up and far away from the equilibrium point, hence unstable equilibrium. So we also have the neutral equilibrium, and this one occurs when the initial equilibrium is stopped and the forces of disturbance or the forces that lead to disturbance lead to a new equilibrium point. So this may occur due to a shift of either the demand and the supply curve through the effect of taxes. So we may have a shift in the demand curve, or we may have a shift in the supply curve, so which may lead to a new equilibrium point being established. And that is what we refer to as the neutral equilibrium.